Did the trade deal behind every single fight we have covered on this channel just collapse? In one sentence, not quite, but Trump just refused to renew it for the next 16 years, which means every dispute over oil, steel, aluminum, cars, and canola we have documented now sits under a giant question mark with no clear expiration date. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what just happened on July 1st, why it matters more than almost anything else in this entire trade war, and what it means for every story this channel has told you about so far. Let's start with the mechanics of what actually happened, because this is not a typical trade dispute. It is something built directly into the structure of the agreement itself. When the current North American trade deal replaced the old NAFTA agreement back in 2020, it included something no major American trade agreement had ever contained before, a mandatory review clause, sometimes called a sunset provision. The three countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, agreed that 6 years after the deal took effect, they would sit down together and formally decide whether to extend it for another 16 years, all the way out to 2042. That 6-year mark arrived on July 1st of this year. This provision did not appear by accident either. It was inserted specifically at the insistence of the first Trump administration during the original negotiations, designed intentionally to prevent trade agreements from becoming, in the words of one trade official at the time, out of date, and to force periodic political pressure that would keep all three countries actively engaged with the agreement's terms rather than letting it run on autopilot for decades. At the time this provision was first proposed, Canadian and Mexican negotiators actually pushed back against it, arguing that building this kind of recurring uncertainty directly into the agreement would discourage exactly the kind of long-term investment a trade deal is supposed to encourage in the first place. Companies deciding whether to build a new factory or sign a decade-long supply contract tend to want confidence that the underlying trade rules will still exist by the time that investment pays off. And a mandatory review clause, even one that does not automatically end the agreement, introduces exactly the kind of doubt that can make those long-term decisions harder to justify. The three countries eventually compromised on the 16-year term specifically to balance that concern against the American desire for periodic reassessment. And this past July was the first real test of how that compromise would actually play out in practice. Canada took this deadline seriously. On June 1st, just 1 month before the review, Canada formally asked the United States and Mexico to renew the agreement for the full 16-year term, essentially proposing to lock in stability through 2042 and put an end to the uncertainty that has defined this entire trade relationship for the past year and a half. That request represented Canada's clearest possible signal of intent, a formal public commitment to the existing framework, made specifically to give Washington every opportunity to simply say yes and restore a measure of predictability to a relationship that had been under sustained strain since these tariff disputes first began. On July 1st, Washington said no. The United States Trade Representative's Office issued a formal statement declining to confirm America's intention to extend the agreement in its current form. Trump himself has been blunt about his feelings toward this deal in the past, previously stating the country would be better off without it entirely and suggesting he would like to see it terminated altogether. The formal refusal to extend does not go quite that far, but it does something almost as significant. It triggers a completely different process, one built around annual reviews rather than a single settled 16-year commitment. Here is exactly what that means going forward. And it is worth understanding precisely because the details matter enormously. The agreement itself does not disappear. It remains fully in force right now, today, covering the same trade rules it always has. But instead of that stability being locked in for another 16 years, the three countries now have to conduct this same review process annually, every single year, continuing until either all three parties eventually agree to extend it, or the agreement simply expires on its original schedule in 2036, or one of the three countries decides to withdraw entirely, which requires 6 months formal notice before taking effect. It is worth being precise about what this annual review process actually requires each time it happens, because it is not simply a symbolic check-in. Each year, government representatives from all three countries formally reconvene to reassess the agreement's performance, addressing everything from investment climate and economic security to ongoing disputes over specific sectors, essentially repeating a smaller version of the same comprehensive evaluation that just took place this July, year after year, for as long as this standoff continues. That is a substantial, recurring diplomatic undertaking, not a quick formality, requiring sustained attention and negotiating resources from all three governments on an ongoing basis, rather than allowing officials to simply set the agreement aside and focus elsewhere for the next decade and a half. Think about what that actually creates in practical terms for every business, every farmer, every auto plant, every steel mill we have discussed on this channel. Instead of operating with the security of a deal locked in until 2042, every company doing cross-border business between these three countries now has to plan around the possibility that this entire framework gets revisited and potentially reshaped every single year indefinitely, for as long as this standoff continues. That kind of persistent uncertainty is its own economic cost, separate from any specific tariff, since businesses making decisions about where to build a new plant, where to sign a long-term supply contract, or where to expand operations now have to factor in the possibility that the rules could shift again at next year's review, rather than trusting in over a decade of settled stability. Economists have a specific term for this kind of cost, calling it uncertainty premium, the extra caution and reduced investment that shows up not because of any single bad policy decision, but simply because decision makers cannot confidently predict what the rules will look like a few years down the road. Unlike a tariff, which shows up as a clear, measurable number on an invoice, an uncertainty premium is harder to see directly, but it shows up indirectly in delayed expansion plans, in slightly higher borrowing costs as lenders price in additional risk, and in companies choosing to diversify their supply chains and customer relationships, specifically to reduce their exposure to any single, increasingly unpredictable trading relationship. Every single diversification story we have covered on this channel, oil heading toward Asia, aluminum heading toward Europe, natural gas racing to establish itself before American alternatives catch up, reflects exactly this kind of uncertainty premium playing out in real, measurable business decisions. Canada's response to this refusal has been notably measured, at least publicly. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, speaking after the trilateral meeting, said the parties agreed on the importance of continuing discussions, careful diplomatic language that avoids escalating the moment into a full-blown crisis while still acknowledging that real, substantive issues remain completely unresolved. LeBlanc specifically confirmed that Canada's priority going forward centers on addressing the sectoral tariffs we have spent this entire channel documenting: steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, the exact industries where we have already shown you real jobs disappearing and real production numbers collapsing. That kind of restrained public messaging, even in the face of a genuinely significant setback, reflects a broader Canadian strategy we have seen play out repeatedly throughout this trade war, avoiding dramatic public confrontation in favor of quieter, sustained diplomatic pressure combined with concrete domestic action to reduce vulnerability wherever possible. Now, here is where this story connects directly to nearly everything we have covered so far, and why understanding this moment matters so much for making sense of everything else. Every single dispute we have documented on this channel exists inside the framework of this larger agreement, even when the tariffs themselves technically bypass or override specific provisions within it. The steel and aluminum tariffs squeezing thousands of Canadian jobs, the auto tariffs that cut Canadian vehicle production nearly in half, the uncertainty hanging over Canada's oil and natural gas export strategy. All of it exists against the backdrop of a trade relationship that, until July 1st, at least had a clear, scheduled moment where the two countries were supposed to sit down and resolve the bigger picture question of whether this partnership continues on stable, predictable terms. Consider the steel story specifically, since we covered it in detail already. Trump's administration offered Canadian steel companies tariff relief in exchange for relocating production to the United States, an offer the United Steelworkers Union called blackmail. That offer makes far more sense once you understand it happened while this larger 16-year renewal question remained completely unresolved. A company being asked to make a permanent decision whether to relocate entirely was being asked to do so without any clarity on whether the broader trading relationship itself would even remain stable enough to make staying in Canada a viable long-term option in the first place. The auto industry story fits this same pattern too. Production cut nearly in half, 500,000 jobs hanging in the balance, all while the fundamental question of whether the underlying trade framework survives intact sat completely unanswered until this July. It is genuinely difficult for an industry this capital intensive to make confident long-term investment decisions when the foundational agreement governing that investment could theoretically be renegotiated or at minimum revisited every single year going forward. Even the canola story, which we framed as an example of Canada solving its own problems independently through direct diplomacy with China, takes on additional meaning here. Carney's willingness to build strong, independent relationships outside the American relationship looks less like an isolated diplomatic choice and more like a deliberate hedge against exactly the kind of uncertainty that July 1st just confirmed as an ongoing reality rather than a temporary phase this relationship would eventually grow out of. That moment came and went without resolution. Instead of a clean answer, either a full renewal restoring confidence, or a clean break creating its own different kind of clarity, we got something messier. An agreement that limps forward 1 year at a time, with every single sectoral dispute we have covered still sitting completely unresolved underneath it. Round 3 of the ongoing negotiations took place in Mexico City just this past week, specifically focused on resolving these outstanding issues. Canada was not confirmed as a direct participant in that particular round. A detail worth noting since it suggests some of the most substantive negotiating may currently be happening through separate bilateral channels rather than one unified trilateral process, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already tangled situation. This kind of fragmented negotiating structure, separate bilateral tracks running alongside the broader trilateral framework, makes it considerably harder for outside observers, and frankly for the companies affected by these decisions, to get a clear, unified picture of where things actually stand at any given moment, since progress or setbacks in one bilateral channel do not necessarily translate directly into the broader, trilateral relationship everyone ultimately depends on. Let's talk about where this actually goes from here, because there are 3 realistic paths, and each one determines the fate of literally every story we have told you on this channel. The first scenario. The annual review process actually works as intended, providing regular checkpoints where incremental progress gets made on individual sectoral disputes, steel 1 year, autos the next, until enough issues get resolved that a future review finally does produce that full 16-year extension, just later than originally planned. In this scenario, think of July 1st not as a failure, but as the beginning of a slower, more grinding negotiation process that eventually arrives at the same destination Canada was originally hoping for, just with several additional years of uncertainty built into the journey. Trade officials on all 3 sides have incentive to eventually find this path, since a series of small, incremental wins is often easier to sell politically than one enormous, controversial, comprehensive deal negotiated all at once. The second scenario, the annual reviews become a recurring source of instability rather than a path toward resolution, with each year's review reopening old wounds without making meaningful progress, gradually eroding business confidence in the entire North American trading relationship until companies on all sides simply start planning around the assumption that this framework may not survive intact. This is the scenario that should concern anyone connected to the industries we have covered, since sustained uncertainty of this kind tends to accelerate exactly the pattern we have already documented. Companies and industries quietly diversifying away from dependence on this relationship rather than waiting indefinitely for it to stabilize. Watch specifically for whether next year's review produces any concrete progress at all or simply repeats this same pattern of postponement, since a second consecutive year without resolution would be a much stronger signal that this scenario is becoming the dominant one. The third scenario, and the one that would represent the most dramatic outcome, one of the three countries eventually decides the annual review process itself has become untenable and formally moves toward withdrawal, triggering that 6-month notice period and genuinely reshaping North American trade for the first time in decades. This remains the least likely outcome, given how deeply integrated these three economies have become. But the mere fact that this path now exists as a formal, documented possibility, built directly into the current framework, represents a meaningful shift from the assumed permanence that characterized trade relationships in this region for the better part of 3 decades. Even a small probability of this outcome is enough to influence corporate planning, since companies making decade-long investment decisions have to weigh even unlikely scenarios if the potential consequences are severe enough. Whichever path unfolds, here is the thread connecting everything we have shown you across every single episode on this channel. Oil finding buyers in Asia, aluminum finding buyers in Europe, natural gas racing ahead of competing American infrastructure, canola getting fixed through direct diplomacy with China, steel and auto jobs hanging in the balance while Canada fights to keep them. Every one of these stories represents Canada responding to exactly the kind of uncertainty that July 1st just confirmed is not going away anytime soon, building alternatives, building leverage, and building independence precisely because the foundational agreement meant to provide stability just failed to deliver it on schedule. Here is my honest read on where this settles. I think the annual review process grinds forward without immediate crisis, since neither side genuinely benefits from the kind of dramatic rupture a full withdrawal would create. But I also think this July 1st refusal marks a real turning point in how Canada approaches this entire relationship going forward, treating stability with the United States as something to actively hedge against rather than something to simply assume, which is exactly the pattern we have watched play out repeatedly across every industry this channel has covered. There is a broader historical parallel worth sitting with here, too. Trade relationships built over decades tend to feel permanent right up until the moment they suddenly do not. And the countries that fare best through that kind of transition are usually the ones who started preparing for uncertainty before the crisis fully arrived, rather than those who kept assuming the old arrangement would simply continue indefinitely. Canada's pattern of diversification across oil, aluminum, and natural gas now looks less like a series of isolated responses to individual disputes, and more like exactly the kind of preparation that becomes valuable precisely when a moment like July 1st arrives and confirms that the old assumptions no longer fully hold. The bigger point I want you to sit with is this: a trade agreement is only as valuable as the certainty it provides. And certainty is precisely what just evaporated on July 1st. Every episode on this channel, every industry we have shown you fighting for survival or finding new footing beyond the American relationship, makes more sense once you understand they are all operating inside this exact uncertainty, an agreement that technically still exists, but no longer comes with any guarantee of lasting past this year's review. Understanding that single fact retroactively reframes almost everything else we have shown you, turning what might have looked like a series of separate, unrelated disputes into one continuous story about a relationship quietly losing its foundation of assumed permanence, one industry, one review, 1 year at a time. So here's the question I want you to sit with. If the foundational trade agreement holding North America together cannot even secure a clean 16-year renewal, Does that tell you this entire relationship is fundamentally more fragile than most people assumed? Or is this simply overdue political theater before the two countries eventually settle back into the same stable arrangement they have relied on for decades? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me which of the industries we have covered on this channel you think gets resolved first. If connecting these individual stories back to the bigger picture is useful to you, hit subscribe because we are going to keep tracking this annual review process as it unfolds and revisit exactly how it affects every industry we have already shown you. And if you have not seen our full breakdown of the steel, auto, or canola disputes specifically, go watch those next, because you will understand this bigger story so much better once you have seen exactly what is at stake in each individual piece of it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.